Hey guys, and welcome to our introduction to the second text that we need to read for Minds and Bodies. This time we're reading a text by J.J.C. Smart. That's Jack Smart, or if you want to know his full name, that is John Jamison Carswell Smart. The text is called Sensations and Brain Processes, and this time we're exploring a materialist account of the mind as opposed to that mind-body dualist perspective of what the mind is, or the spiritual substance account of the mind according to Descartes. Now, what's our overall goal? We need to develop some prior knowledge so that we can understand the context of Smart's text. We're not going to be able to really understand what Smart is trying to do or what he's trying to argue if you don't understand the other issues that existed at the time that the text was being written. So the three small goals that we need to achieve in order to achieve the big goal are: we need to name and define different terms. We need to explore the historical and academic context of Smart's thinking. And then we need to familiarize ourselves with some of Smart's concerns. So could you write those down, 1, 2, 3, for me, please? And then have a look at this APK and tell me what area of psychology it represents. Oh, I forgot to say too, once you've written these down, score yourself out of 4 for each of those success criteria. Of course, then move on to your APK, have a look at this picture, and tell me what area of psychology it represents. Okay, so what do we need to know first in order to understand Smart's thinking? Well, it's pretty simple. One of the first areas is neuroscience. Then we need to look at a theory of philosophy that we'll call identity theory. And it's not what we would believe now. It's basically a form of materialism, which also came to be known as Australian materialism. We're going to look at this term called behaviorism, which is very important to understand what it is that ultimately Smart comes to reject. And then we need to look at something called logical positivism and the linguistic term, which is not in any way different. Well, it's not, sorry, not different, but it's not in any way more complex than you may think it is. It's actually a pretty simple concept to get, okay? All right, so neuroscience. Well, the way we understand it now and the way it would have been understood in the 1950s is that the brain is divided into different regions and it has its own anatomy. And different parts of the brain are responsible for different functions. We can kind of understand that now. We also have an understanding, of which Smart would have had at the time too, that the brain is made up of a series of neurons that communicate with each other using electrical impulses. And here's what it would look like if it was on a video. Alright, so a pretty simple video, it's quite easy to get. Basically, you can see nerves are communicating with each other and transmitting messages or trying to get other neurons excited by firing electrical signals at them. Now, how does this happen? The brain isn't purely electrical, it's also chemical. So we have this thing called a synaptic cleft. I'll just mute her. And if you look at the synaptic cleft, it shows us that the brain isn't just electrical, but it's highly chemical. And what it does is it shoots from one nerve cell, these things called neurotransmitters, to another nerve cell. And that is what triggers an electric impulse. So we'll watch. Okay, so the nerve cell's just sucked up all of its neurotransmitters again to fire again. And then there they are. Now they're being fired out of the neuron and they interact with the other cell, the other neuron. And if there's enough of them, they create an electric response. Perfect. And that shows us that the brain isn't just electrical, it's electrochemical. And we understand that it's a series of interconnected neuronal circuits. It's really easy to get. And this would have been the view of the way that the brain worked in the 1950s. Okay? Now, a lot of people at the time were starting to realize, hang on, if we can think of our mental states and how we think mentally, and we can pinpoint the exact part of the brain and the exact mental processes that cause that particular way of thinking and the behavior that manifests from it. So all we really need to do is just get better at measuring and understanding how the brain works in order to understand our mental states. That's what neuroscience was suggesting, and I think you should take a note. Okay, now Smart wasn't a scientist. He was an identity theorist in the 1950s. And together with other people, he managed to invent or come up with a theory of philosophy that is quite well known. It's called identity theory, but it's also known as Australian materialism. He did it with one American, Herbert Feigl, another person called William Place, another person called David Armstrong, and himself, which is J.J.C. Smart. These three were Australian, one guy was American, so if it's all these guys basically contributing to the theory, the majority of them are Australian, and identity theory ends up being known as Australian materialism. Now, what is it? It's really simple theory to get, okay? It basically says that mental states match descriptions of the brain. Take a note. Now, the reason why I said descriptions of the brain is because it means that I don't have, we could have different versions of how the brain works, but we could always find a way that the brain functions and how it works, which corresponds with an experienced mental state. So that's why I didn't say neuronal activities of the brain. Later on, we may find out that it works a bit differently. But the basic assumption of Australian materialism, which is really identity theory, that's what we're going to call it, identity theory, is that mental states, thoughts, emotions, desires, everything like that, match or correspond directly with something that happens in the brain. Now, what's really important is that for the philosopher, you just make that assumption. You might not know what the mental state of the brain is yet, but you can develop a philosophy based on this general assumption. Okay? For example, at the time, people knew that these particular neurons called C fibers were firing whenever a pain stimulus was introduced to the body. So from a identity theorist's point of view, basically pain equals C fibers firing. There's really no difference. The brain state corresponds with the mental state. They are two different ways of describing the same phenomena. Okay. So the idea of identity theory is also linked with this combining dualistic kind of things that previously thought to be separate. So oxygen and hydrogen, 2 parts oxygen, 1 part hydrogen, were kind of thought to be, no, sorry, other way around. H2O. No, I'm not thinking straight. H2O, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. They were kind of thought to be, like, nobody ever thought that those two things put together would end up creating water, but science has found, or chemistry has found, that basically water is a molecule made out of 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, okay? And that is really important because what it's saying is that previously unrelated phenomena can be combined in some way, and we can understand them basically as 2 different perspectives on the same phenomena. Okay, take a note. So that's kind of what identity theory really is. It's this idea that mental states have directly corresponding brain states, and they are just basically the same thing. It's just that you're using a different language to describe them. Okay. One is more of a brain-based neuroscience perspective, and the other is more of a psychological perspective, but really they are the same thing. Now, this raises the following question. What does identity actually mean? Do 2 people see red in exactly the same way? Do they have exactly the same perception brain states or corresponding states in the brain? when they see red? Or is it different depending on their biological makeup or any kind of other environmental effect? Now, if you believe that the brain states when someone sees red are exactly the same, that's what we call type identity, all right? Type identity theory is basically saying if everything in the brain was repeated exactly the same way for person A and person B, they would see red exactly the same way. But if you believe that maybe, just maybe, one brain can see red and has just a slightly different brain activity to another person who sees red and has another another slightly different brain activity, then you would be arguing for token theory, which is basically we both see red, but we see red a little bit differently because our brains might be wired a bit differently. And I don't know if this was something that we should be reading into token theory, but we could also say that it could be because we have different kind of connections, or basically the red that we see isn't the same experience because our brain is wired differently. Take a note. So identity theory equals Australian materialism, which equals a belief that all mental states have corresponding brain states or brain phenomena. You can have type, which basically says if you reproduce the same phenomena or brain state in different brains, you get exactly the same kind of perception. And then you've got token, which says maybe the brain sees something or experiences something that they perceive to be the same, like I see red and you see red. But of course, the brain reacts a little differently. It behaves a bit differently. Okay, it's token. Another really important theory, which is being kind of argued against in the long run, is behaviorism, which is really important. So Smart is not a behaviorist. In fact, he kind of rejects it near the end of his text. But he's heavily influenced by it because behaviorism was extremely popular in the 1950s. And there's no doubt about it, as I said before, Skinner and Watson, two extremely popular behaviorists, really did influence the way that Smart thought about the brain. So he really was influenced by this behaviorist theory. So what is behaviorism? Well, if we look at Watson and Skinner, they're the two main proponents of behaviorist theory, and then other people kind of branched off from them. And it says basically that mental states such as feelings, desires, thoughts, etc., can never really be observed. They're impossible to observe. So because we can't observe them, we can't really scientifically study them. We can't base a science on them because we can't objectively measure them, test them, and observe them. Take a note. So the mind, according to Skinner and Watson, is like a black box. It exists. We don't doubt that thoughts and the mind exist and everything like that. You just can't base a science on them because they are not something that is objectively observable and easy to study using the scientific method. So any kind of psychology then has to become a psychology of behavior because behavior is very, very easy to observe and to observe objectively. So behaviorism is this idea that the mind is a black box and it receives inputs and then generates outputs in the form of behavior. And that behavior is what the observer observes and then develops its scientific theory on. Take a note. So being happy from a behaviorist point of view isn't saying that the person feels happy. A behaviorist wouldn't say that. A behaviorist would say the person is smiling and seems to be engaging in a very positive manner, i.e., you describe the physical observation and the behavior. You don't try or you don't explain or acknowledge the internal state that might be there. Notice in my description I tried to avoid a discussion about happiness. Likewise, if I was saying, instead of saying the person is angry, we'd say the person has thrown themselves on the floor and is crying and shouting extremely loud words. You know, we're describing the physical phenomena here. We're not really describing Now, we can attach socially assumed words to it, like the person is angry because he is jumping up and down on the ground and now he's thrown himself on the floor and he's crying. You can kind of do that, but the proof of the angriness isn't some kind of internal state, it's the manifested behavior. Hardcore behaviorists will avoid using any word or reference to a mental state. A lot of behaviorists will say this emotion occurs because of the behavior. So just be mindful of that, okay? Now, this guy called Ulam Place said, look, I like the idea of the scientific approach to behaviorism, and I like the idea that it is actually trying to, develop that kind of scientific method. But it doesn't acknowledge my first person account of myself. As a first person, I experience this myself as the center of all sensation. I am the center of so many different things that I experience. So there is an I, there is a subject there, and this I does tend to have internal mental states, which I'm very much aware of. And in a sense, Smart kind of agrees with this and says, look, yeah, we need to account for these internal mental states and these internal experiences. But we need to reject the substance dualism of Descartes and just argue for some kind of monoistic materialism where the mind and the brain are the same thing, right? But, and this is really important, we also need to accept that kind of subjective experience we have of the mind, but use a materialist philosophy to get there. All right, take a note. So you can see that there's kind of a bit of sympathy for Descartes here in that we do experience the world from a subjective point of view and an awareness of internal mental states. But there is a rejection of that mind-body dualism, which is built into an assumption of Australian identity theory or Australian materialism, which is basically that all mental states directly correspond with a physical brain state. Okay? Now, this seems unbelievably complicated, and it's not. It's called logical positivism and the linguistic turn. And basically, it says that philosophy in the beginning of the 1900s towards the 1950s is really, it should try and be like a science. It should be like a science. Now, it can't be a science because that's not its role. It can't test and verify things using the scientific method purely, but it can use logic to kind of mimic the scientific perspective. So the point is that we should use logic and understand how logic works in order to understand the world that we live in. Okay? And so, in order to understand the world that we live in, it's not just important to look at how we look at logic, but how does language reflect logic? And therefore, how does language capture our understanding and the description of the world? How does language capture logic? And how do we use language to describe the world that we live in, right? Now, a lot of our current philosophical theory is heavily influenced by this idea of studying language and how it's used to construct our understanding of the world. However, we're not that hardcore about it anymore. But during the 50s, it was a pretty big area of philosophy. And, using and studying logic and how language has its own logic and captures logic and how it's therefore used to represent the world that we live in and describe it was a pretty big shift in philosophy, and we call this the linguistic turn. So we got logical positivism, which basically says that we can understand the world better through using logic. And we've got the linguistic turn, which is basically saying we need to study how language applies logic and then describes the world and the phenomena that we observe. All right? Take a note. All right, so you should be able to say that we named 4 really key events. It's neuroscience, oops, get rid of that. Neuroscience, Australian materialism, otherwise known as identity theory, behaviorism, and logical positivism, which is basically trying to use logic as a way of understanding reality, and the linguistic term, which is our basic attempt to look at how language captures logic and uses it to describe and understand the world. All those things come together to give us the understanding what was going on in the 1950s and understand the historical and academic context which Smart was developing his philosophy and the text we're about to read. And we can understand one of his concerns was to account for the subjective experience of the human being, but still do it in a way that is deeply materialist. If you understand all of that, give yourself a 4. If you don't, you've got to come and talk to me. And you should know that this black box here refers to the behaviourist movement, which was emerging out of the 50s, or no, actually it wasn't emerging, it was just predominating the 50s. All right, thank you. Cheers.